Ajay and his family are farmers, or they used to be, because the rising sea levels have now caused the salination of the soils of his farm, rendering the farm unviable. So they moved to the city of Mumbai, where they can only afford to live in the slums, eking out a living as streetwalkers. However, climate change catches up with them, and the slums become unlivable and even fatal due to persistent flooding and heat waves. So as a last resort, Ajay applies to the UN Migratory Office in Mumbai for his family and himself. And in his application, he lists all of his family's skills and the countries they would most like to move to in order of preference. As UN passport holders, they have the right to enter any country in the world, but they don't necessarily have the right to social security support. And for that, they need to be allocated a placement through the UN Migratory Office. Ajay and his family are eventually offered a placement in Scotland, which they can choose to accept, reject, or appeal against, but in this case, they choose to accept. It comes with a condition, many conditions, one of them being that they must work for a minimum period in a sector chosen by the local government at their destination. This allows for the efficient funneling of labour to where it is needed at the local destinations. And after 5 years of working at the destination, they can apply for full citizenship in the country. This is all a hypothetical scenario dreamed up by Gaia Vince in her book Nomad Century. Hello for the first time, or welcome back, whichever it may be for you. I am going to get right to the content today because Gaia Vince's book Nomad Century was very dense with information. There's a lot to cover, and I tried to squeeze it down as well as I could without kind of diluting the message too much. I don't know how well I did, so you can let me know in the comments. To begin with, as an introduction to Gaia Vince herself, she is an environmental reporter by trade. She's also the author of Adventures in the Anthropocene, which investigated how we have industrialized our way into a new geological epoch. And Nomad Century is a kind of a follow-up from that, and she's investigating now how we can create an existence for ourselves as a species in this new world of our own making. Nomad Century has a little bit in common with Empty Planet, which was the last non-fiction that I reviewed, in that it focuses on what Empty Planet proffered as a solution to population decline, namely migration. But my main criticism of Empty Planet was that it ignored the effects that climate change would have on population in the future. And in that sense, Nomad Century is everything that population decline wasn't, because that is the main focus of this book. The forecast for unprecedented migration in the world, which we're seeing the beginnings of already, by the way, is predicated on what climate change is going to do to much of the habitable world, driven by the most likely scenario of a 3.7 degree Celsius global temperature rise by 2100. So the lethal combination of heat and humidity as it worsens over the next half century will put an estimated 3.5 billion people in harm's way. And drought, fires, floods, rising sea levels, heat waves will uproot many more people. An unavoidable and logical consequence in a world in which Gaia Vince has dwindling faith that we will accomplish our COP goals of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius is that people will have to, in effect, evacuate their home regions. In the opening chapters of the book, Gaia Vince reminds us, fills us in, convinces us, whatever is necessary for the given individual, that we are facing a challenge, climate change, that is unprecedented and epoch-changing in scale. Up front, she disabuses us of the idea that the climate change that we're seeing today has a precedent in human history. 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and it's 425 ppm now, by the way, is a higher concentration than the Earth has seen in 3 million years. And humans have only been around for a tenth of that. So we're under the illusion that the climate stability is the norm, because we came down in the last shower. Humans have evolved into and been enjoying an unusually stable climatic era in Earth's history. So Gaia Vince tells us that there's almost universal acceptance of anthropogenic climate change worldwide, and we have made efforts to mitigate it to some extent, and there have been some key multilateral steps towards making emissions reduction pledges more ambitious. There have been technological leaps forward in some sectors so that it's now cheaper to install a new wind plant rather than generate the same energy using existing coal-powered plants. And while it's important to encourage positive steps in the direction of mitigating climate change, the bottom line tells it all. Our emissions continue to rise. Short of a sudden catastrophic civilizational collapse, it's hard to imagine how we could possibly meet our target of halving emissions by 2025, which is only 7 months away. The suitably apocalyptic epithet, the four horsemen of the Anthropocene, condenses down for us the reality of what we're facing in the rest of the century. Fire, heat, drought, and floods. Combined, these four will make many regions of the world, equatorial regions, the tropics, many coastal regions, islands especially, literally incapable of supporting human life in the coming decades. The time we have left to adapt is very short, and the costs of protecting many areas is already prohibitive and often a case of kicking the can down the road. Vince makes it very clear that every fraction of a degree of warming that we avert is worth it, because the cost of trying to stay alive in every degree of warming in the world will always be greater than the cost of averting that extra degree of warming. However, we are currently on a trajectory to warm the Earth by between 3 and 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and we're showing no clear signs of deviating from that trajectory. So, given that, it would be very short-sighted of us to not prepare for this eventuality. The strategy we need to survive climate change and prevent civilizational collapse, Vince argues, should be a species-wide approach, a pan-species approach. And if many of the regions of the world become uninhabitable, we have to accept that people will have to move out of those regions. Vince makes the persuasive argument, in my opinion, that migration and cooperation are integral to our evolutionary history. Without them, we would not be here today. There would be no Homo sapiens. History is both a record of its subject matter and its own contemporary perspective. So we see everything from where we happen to be standing in time. We see everything through a lens, a contemporary lens. And we say that humans' inherent selfishness and kind of mutual oppositionality overrides the collectivist aspect of our natures, because that is what our current ideology rewards. But historically, and I mean like most of human history, has been pre-industrial and collectivist. And if there was a threat or a scarcity in one area or an incentive in another, we did the obvious thing. We moved. And we knew that if we wanted to survive, that we had to cooperate with one another. By taking this broader temporal view of humanity, we can see that borders and national identities are the anomalies. According to Vince, it is our current political paradigm that makes us see migration as such a threat, and when in fact it is actually the obvious solution to our problems. There is no such thing as racial or ethnic purity. Every surviving population can claim ancestry across the world. The fact that our species migrated out of Africa to populate every continent bar Antarctica relatively recently in history means that there's much less genetic diversity amongst us than you would typically find among other species that are widely distributed around the world. Furthermore, not or refusing to mix with other populations could be detrimental historically. And there is an example of this in the Dorset people who, having guarded their genetic and cultural isolation for thousands of years, eventually accumulated so many vulnerabilities that it led to their own extinction. After presenting us with her argument for viewing migration as essential to our success as a species, Vince turns to the detractors of her manifesto. Vince doesn't deny the challenges to be overcome in a nomad century, challenges such as resource management and overcrowding and the pressures to expand costly infrastructure. But she considers these to be only equal in magnitude to the challenge of overcoming our geopolitical norm of tribal identities and hard borders. She asks us to examine the almost universally unchallenged acceptance of the notion that freedom of movement should be curtailed based on national identity. And just as a little addition to this, let me add, let's be real, not based merely on national identity, but based on money. To be very general in my terms, outgroup bias is a blend of the prejudices that we imbibe from an early age and the instinct to favour whoever those prejudices have taught us are members of the in-group. This cultural and psychological tendency has been harnessed today by political interests in the form of nationalism. And nationalism tends to deflect our attention away from internal conflict towards perceived external conflict, often contrived external conflict. And as it does this, as our antipathy towards the outgroup strengthens, so does our allegiance to the in-group. And this helps certain political interests secure tighter top-down control over a population. As I mentioned earlier, the invention of the nation state happened relatively recently in history. And prior to this concept, lands were defined primarily by the bloodlines of their leaders. And normal people's identities had very little to do with who was ruling the lands that they were living in. It was only with the Industrial Revolution that the model of the nation state became the most efficient for ruling, and microstates became unviable because they lacked the resources needed for industrialization. And large empires became too unwieldy because they required more governance for the greater social coordination required by industrialization. National identity was an act of myth-making. It was actively and pragmatically created through mass media and mass education to standardize vernaculars and cement united identities. More essential to a national identity than flags and anthems is a complex bureaucracy. And this is because it provides inclusion or equity between citizens in the eyes of the state, which can help to unite disparate groups in a country. And, all of this sounds like a deception. And I think group identities kind of are, not that they don't serve a purpose. And Vince even says that the idea of a national identity is going to be a critical component in the challenge of properly integrating migrants into their new homes. Unfortunately, in recent years, borders have become increasingly restrictive, and anti-immigration propaganda has stoked the fears and prejudices of many people. Vince emphasizes that building walls and demonizing migrants may serve to cause death and hardship to people who are merely trying to flee an unlivable situation, but it can't stop migration. And given that the conditions that we've created, primarily in the global north and the developed countries, has made migration unavoidable, then in that case, we ought not to be trying to avoid it because it's unavoidable. We ought to be accepting it, facilitating it, managing it, and even encouraging it. Amazingly, in Vince's opinion, we have no global body overseeing the movement of people. And she thinks it's a huge mistake that foreign ministries manage migrants instead of labour ministries, because she thinks that it would be more efficient for labour ministries to match workers with job markets. We have extensive mechanisms for the movement of goods, but we have no meaningful multilateral mechanisms for the efficient movement of labour. Vince also attacks the distinction made between refugees and economic migrants, and how this is used to label some as worthy and others as unworthy. Climate displaced people now outnumber those fleeing political persecution, and yet The former will often be labelled as economic migrants and seen as less worthy of migration, even though climatic changes such as drought will have made their home regions unlivable. Aside from the ethical reasons for facilitating the movement of human beings, migration is by far the most efficient way of lifting people out of poverty. There are actually selfish reasons for developed countries to welcome migrants. The next and largest portion of the book takes on the daunting task of convincing us of how we can all benefit from a great relocation of human beings in the world and how we can best accomplish the new societies of the future. Not only does migration allow for the reduction of poverty because migrants can move to parts of the world where their work is needed, but it also reduces poverty in the origin countries for their families and communities. In answer to the objection that migration leads to brain drain in the origin country, Vince assures us that this is the exception to the norm, and when it is a risk, it can be overcome through bilateral agreements between countries. It's further offset by the flow of money in the form of remittances back to the origin countries. And remittances are a lifeline that far surpass aid in terms of the impact they have on economic development in the areas that money goes to. So successful emigrants also create business networks that benefit the economies of their origin countries. And they set an example through their educational and economic attainments, they set an example to their families and neighbours, and they aid those who would follow in their footsteps. But what's going to be more critical to convincing the naysayers is the evidence for why migrants enrich their host countries. It really does say a lot about the power of propaganda over evidence that people still believe that migrants are a net burden to the economies they move to. A landmark report by the McKinsey Institute claims that better economic and social integration of migrants could lay the groundwork for economic gains of up to $1 trillion globally. This is a matter of more efficient distribution of skills and labour, but also a matter of increased consumption. Numerous studies have shown that even a very large influx of migrants doesn't negatively impact the wages and the employment prospects of native-born workers and can even have a positive impact. And Gaia gives various different reasons for this. So number one, the increase in demand for workers offsets the increase in supply. And this is because each immigrant increases the demand for products and services. Everybody has to avail of products and services in the local economy. Number two, low-skilled migration decreases the rate of adoption of mechanization and automation. Number three, the reorganization of the labour market triggered by immigration generally moves native-born workers up in a hierarchy of employability. And at the very least, native-born workers have an edge over immigrants in terms of their linguistic and cultural fluency. Now, number four, I think, is a simplistic assessment that leaves Vince open to refutation, but I'm going to state it as she states it. Most jobs available to immigrants are the jobs that native-born workers won't do. Number five, there is a high rate of entrepreneurship among immigrants, and they are likely to employ other migrants as well as native-born workers. As I discussed in this video, the global birth rate is falling and it's most severe in the developed world. For business as usual, the shrinking of a working population is a kind of a death knell. It spells stagnation and negative growth and a loss of the taxes that are used to support a growing population of elderly people. A capitalist system simply doesn't allow for that, and the solution is staring it in the face. But we're working against the clock, and if we want to move billions of people out of unlivable situations into more stable regions where they are needed, Vince introduces the idea of an intergovernmental body, the UN Migration Organization. This would be an entity with teeth that would have the power to ensure that countries meet their migratory quotas, and it would be funded by an international taxation system. Integration costs wouldn't be footed by countries alone because the UNMO would invest in countries to help with the expansion of infrastructure and the building of entirely new cities. Based on the historical precedent of the Nansen passport, Vince imagines a scenario where each of us would receive a passport from the UN as an official document representing our citizenship of Earth. Using this passport and a quota system that it would ensure that everybody would receive safe relocation, if necessary, in a way that makes good economic and demographic sense, the UN Migratory Organization would oversee the application to an allocation of placements, as illustrated by the example that I gave in the introduction. But of course, there's still the problem of xenophobia. How do we shift our mindset from one of hard borders and national identities to one of a human commonwealth? The media and social media are rife with misinformation and propaganda dehumanizing immigrants, and politicians are exploiting this prejudice to their own ends. But the evidence demolishes this anti-immigration narrative. For example, immigrants are far less likely to be in receipt of social welfare than natives, and studies show no increase in crime associated with migratory patterns, except in a few cases where immigrants are forbidden to work. In the US, immigrants are far less likely to commit crimes than native-born people, and countries with the fewest immigrants are the ones that display the greatest anti-immigration sentiment. It should be very telling to us that the population least likely to hold prejudicial views about immigrants is the population that has the most experience living in diverse environments, that being younger and more urban people. Fearing change is understandable, but in this case, it doesn't really help matters. And it is on the horizon one way or another. And Vince gives us a choice in order to illustrate how we don't really have one. So A, we choose a world with a shrunken workforce, with a large elderly population whom we are unable to care for, a social environment of fear against the backdrop of increasing conflict, famine and death, alongside all the hardships and instability that climate change brings. Or B, we choose a world in which our economic conditions allow for much better management and protection of all members of society, where there is more harmony, but a lot of foreign people living with us in denser cities. We have no choice but to overcome our silly prejudices, Vince says, basically. And firstly, the fear that the white race will be overrun by dark-skinned people is a denial of our human ancestry, and it helps no one. There is a very, very, very good chance that if you are white yourself, that your descendants in 1 to 3 generations will not be. And the only thing that you should really be concerned about, Vince says somewhat humorously, is whether or not they're going to get enough vitamin D, because after all, they're going to be living in higher latitudes. Secondly, the myth of meritocracy justifies the suffering of some based on the idea that they are undeserving of nice lives, happy lives, when in actual fact, it is owing to unjust societal structures that they suffer. When people feel excluded from prosperity, it can be simpler to blame the outsider, the immigrant, rather than the deep structural inequality that remains relatively invisible to many people. Vince advocates for the strong nation state. She believes that only they can ensure the unity of identity and purpose necessary for overcoming our shared challenges. She argues that we can start building more cosmopolitan identities around the natural environment and the recognition that we can't survive without it. And a new patriotic narrative would be built around our shared cultural attachment to nature and its conservation and civic mindedness, instead of insularity and the irresponsible exploitation of the natural environment. Additionally, reducing inequality must be a priority, because the state must invest in the people in order for the people to feel invested in the state. And this can be accomplished through limits to free market capitalism and environmental regulatory controls. And what else? and dynamic social policy. In other words, everything that the right hates. In the future that we are currently headed towards, most of the habitable land is going to lie above the 45th parallel north, and which is now entering a annual average temperature of 13 degrees Celsius, which is optimum for a human civilization. So, as well as Northern Europe falling within that band of, in that habitable zone, we're looking at countries like Alaska and Greenland and Siberia and maybe South Patagonia, and even perhaps Antarctica will start greening. We're looking at those areas becoming the refuges for humanity. If the 21st century is to be the century of the nomad, it will also be the century of the megacity. Cities have the potential to do more with less, and this is especially true when they are dense. But cities of the future will need to be better planned so as to be safe and inclusive and climate resilient and in harmony with the natural environment. As well as expanding infrastructure, it will be necessary to invest in social capital and ensure a good blend of different zones. In some cases, Vince argues that governance should be devolved to local communities, making stakeholders out of citizens who therefore have an immediate interest in the holistic success of their communities. Vince sees potential in various possible political arrangements, including charter cities within states and the incorporation of multiple states under larger geopolitical entities and also caretaker states. Some of these arrangements seem susceptible to predatory relationships, such as the idea that a poorer state would pay a richer state to govern regions within its borders. Some of the ideas are designed to be temporary in nature, with climate refugees returning to their own regions after climate change has been conquered and those regions have been restored. And I couldn't decide whether this was farsightedness that eludes me or a stubborn shift to quixotism on the part of Vince. As one example of what is possible, Vince mentions Hong Kong, which left me a little bit nonplussed. For all the adventurousness of these ideas, Vince doesn't think it would be wise to abandon all of our geopolitical conventions, and she somewhat gives the limited time as a reason for this. Vince allocates a couple of chapters at the end of the book to the changes we must make to undertake the broader challenge of a transition to a workable society, a challenge of which the managed movement of billions is only one component. In a chapter allocated to our food system, Vince makes it crystal clear that our food system needs a major overhaul, and there's no way around this. Apart from the fact that in its current form, it makes us highly vulnerable to multiple breadbasket failure, it is contributing to the breakdown of climate stability. It's perhaps the main driver of biodiversity loss, and it's incredibly wasteful. Food production will have to become more intensive and also more innovative, and sorry to tell you this, but largely plant-based. We'll also need to stop producing so much food waste, not only along the supply chain, but as consumers in the domestic environment, especially in the rich world. So this is just one chapter in a book, and if you want a more thorough and focused analysis of our food system situation, I highly recommend this book, which is really about a sustainable and ecological food system and what is necessary, the shifts that we need to undertake. And I recommend this book, in fact, more than it's George Monbiot's Regenesis. I recommend it more than the book I'm reviewing. I'm reviewing the wrong book. The second chapter that deals with resource management discusses how we must change our water and energy and manufacturing sectors. Our energy system is neither equitable nor sustainable. Vince says it contributes 87% of greenhouse gas emissions, and I've seen other estimates, but for all estimates, it's the greatest proportion of greenhouse gas emissions. At this rate, with the growth in population size and the movement of people to urban centres where per capita energy consumption is higher, which she glosses over, to my consternation, we are going to need 7 times more energy by 2100. Vince stresses that we need to decarbonize over the next 2 or 3 decades, and we need to do it in an equitable way. I won't list the various alternatives to fossil fuels because you're already aware of them. The potential for growth in the renewable energy sector is huge, and they all have their detractors. None of them is perfect, but nearly all of them are preferable to the continuation of burning fossil fuels. Nuclear fusion won't save us, as its predicted development is about a decade and a half away, which will be too late. Carbon capture and storage has not been proven effective at the scale that it is needed at, and not anywhere near that. To achieve net zero by 2050, rich countries are going to have to stop entirely burning fossil fuels by 2030, and Vince expresses her doubt over this happening. Vince is critical of degrowth theories and instead champions environmentally and socially sustainable growth. What's that? But she's also critical of how GDP is calculated, and she believes that redistributive policy will be necessary. These include taxing companies that replace workers with robots. She's for robot labour where human labour is impossible. Taxing the pathological phenomenon of billionaires out of existence, and more investment in higher institutions of education and in healthcare. Essentially, though, Vince is convinced of the idea that growth is necessary to lift a large proportion of the population out of poverty, and she believes that we can innovate our way out of resource limitations. Before the conclusion of the book, Vince discusses how we might restore the natural world. And since 55% of GDP is dependent on the health of biodiversity and ecosystem services, there's more than a selfless reason to do so. So as well as human migration, other species will have to migrate out of unsafe areas into safer habitats. And so, we should ensure that there are nature corridors for those animals. Large swathes of land abandoned by humans will be habitable by many species, and these will be huge opportunities for the reclamation of land by different flora and fauna. Interestingly, despite the massive exodus of humans out of the middle latitudes, Vince thinks it's overly ambitious or excessive to dedicate 50% of the landmass to other species, as advocated by E.O. Wilson. And she thinks it would be sufficient, I don't know how she's come to this conclusion, but sufficient to allocate a third, because that would be enough to save about 70% of species. As well as habit restoration and regenerative farming and GMOs, Vince considers geoengineering of various risks to be all good candidates for recouping our natural world, but biofuels less so. In essence, this book is a manifesto for the ethical and pragmatic migration of huge populations out of areas made unsafe by anthropogenic climate change into areas of relative safety. In order to sell us this idea, Vince appeals to our common sense to see borders for the human cages that they are, made utterly senseless in the Anthropocene. She also argues that cultures thrive through mixing and evolving, not through remaining static, and that cultures in northern latitudes will benefit from an influx of new citizens. But there will be challenges, which she acknowledges, and she gives us a plethora of good ideas to help us make this pan-species vision a reality. She beseeches us to understand that a climate-resilient future will be a future in which humans have the freedom to roam. For a book of just over 200 pages, Vince really gives everything of herself. She leaves us with very few questions about what she thinks herself. But that's not to say that I don't have criticisms. I do. Now, don't get me wrong. Vince is clearly a very erudite and experienced individual, and I can see her smiting me with her intellect. But we have to read with a mixture, a good balance of open-mindedness and critical mindedness. And that's what I've tried to do here. It's impossible to give every topic the word count that it's due in a book that numbers just 200 pages, just a little over 200 pages. But Vince, multiple times, she glosses over topics that I would consider contentious, and she quotes figures that leave me a little bit cross-eyed. For example, she states the UN calculates that we will need to produce 80% more food to feed 2 billion extra city dwellers, but with no explanation. Does that mean that city dwellers eat more than rural dwellers? I didn't think that was the answer to the question. Vince had no source that I could see in the endnotes, so I had to work from the quote alone. And what I found was a report that was written in partnership with the UN, and which estimates that global food demand will increase by about 50% by 2050. And this still seems disproportionate for 2 billion extra people, but not when you realize that the authors factored in the need to raise the nutritional health of people whose diets are currently lacking in calories and micronutrients, and the prediction that demands for dairy and meat will increase very significantly. It's worth mentioning, though, that the authors strongly advise that we curb the projected growth in demand for these. Another kind of oversight or a quote that lacks explanation is Vince states that hydrogen is a clean fuel. And hydrogen takes more energy to produce than it releases when it is burned. And it is currently produced using fossil fuels. And contrary to common understanding, hydrogen actually has a potent warming potential and it's prone to leakage. So using current methods for its production, hydrogen is not a clean fuel. Vince casts a wide net in considering many different solutions, and indeed an adaptive, multi-agent, multi-mode, multi-scale solution will be needed to tackle something as complex as our food system. But some of these solutions come across as more credible than others. While she rightly points out that the biggest impact can be achieved through switching to a primarily algae, plant and fungi-based diet, she also lists solutions that are either unsupported, their efficacy is unsupported by the evidence, or whose ecological footprint would be much larger than any plant, algae or fungi-based foods, or who would only be open to a very select minority of elites. And in the latter case, those wealthy people would be effectively buying an outsized right to pollute by eating those foods. And this seems out of step with the tone of the rest of the book. Vince is aware of the argument for switching from a growth-based economy to a steady state or degrowth-based one. And her argument against doing so rests more on the infeasibility of switching in the short term rather than economic arguments as such. But she does believe that it isn't possible to end poverty without maintaining a growth-based economy. In order for Vince to be correct about this, it must be possible for us to decouple economic activities from material limits on a finite planet. But even if zero carbon emissions result from economic activities, with a growth-based model, it wouldn't be sufficient to keep recycling back material resources into the economy, because since it's always growing, we would always have a need for more materials. We would always need to consume more, and even more than more, when our population starts to decline. So as much as Vince professes to mourn the loss of the natural world, there isn't any real competition between human interests and the rest of the natural world. For example, the movement of populations into previously unpopulated wildernesses is accepted without any real misgivings. Agriculture and mineral extraction on land made newly available by the melting of the permafrost, for example, is seen as permissible, or at least inevitable. She advocates high-risk geoengineering over radical lifestyle change or degrowth, whose proponents she accuses of being puritanical and zealous and willing to inflict discomfort on people. She says that with our best efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions, we will not be able to avoid a 3-degree rise in temperature above pre-industrial levels. But maybe this is because she cannot entertain giving up many of the assumptions of our economic paradigm that has actually made us the dominant geological force on this planet. The writer of Adventures in the Anthropocene is very anthropocentric. My closing thought is really that alienation is the enemy. Alienation from each other, alienation from the natural world, from our descendants who are going to inherit the earth that we are forming with our actions. Our fates are intertwined, and it makes sense that we tackle our shared challenges as one, as a united front. Vince's book is no doubt going to be seen as radical, too radical by many people. But I think in mending the chasm between the human heart and the rest of humanity and nature, the rest of nature, I should say, because humans are, we forget it, but we are part of nature. I think that she doesn't go far enough. I think Nomad Century is only the beginning. Once again, thank you so much for staying to the end of this video and exploring this book together with me and all the topics in it. And if you have any thoughts on the content of this video, please share them below in the comments. I look forward to reading them. And until next time, stay well, stay curious, and stay reading.